The Elven King laughed, unaware of the human secret. Lord Cayalathyr stood upon the celestial balcony of Lunethril, the ancient elven city that had never fallen in 10,000 years. His silver robes caught the moonlight as he gazed down at the human army camped at the base of the crystal walls, walls that hummed with protective enchantments older than any human kingdom. He laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a summer breeze, as he watched the pathetic creatures setting up their strange metal tubes on wooden tripods. They called them cannons, or so his spies had reported. How quaint, how desperate. "They bring sticks and iron to challenge the eternal city," he said to his council, his voice dripping with contempt. "Perhaps we should have given them 200 years. They clearly need more time to understand their place in this world." The elven lords around him smiled, the perfect faces radiating the casual cruelty of those who had never known defeat. Below, a human officer, a soot-stained woman named Genevieve Marchand, adjusted the elevation of her cannon and whispered something to her crew. Cayalathyr couldn't hear her words, but if he could, they would chill his immortal blood. "Maximum charge, tower base, on my mark." In 72 hours, the eternal city would be rubble, and the age of elven supremacy would end not with magic, but with mathematics, chemistry, and the terrifying ingenuity of a species that refused to kneel. We'll find out what happens next in just a moment. But first, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's get back to the story. The great hall of Montclair fell silent as the elven messenger finished speaking. King Etienne sat frozen on his throne, his weathered hands gripping the armrests until his knuckles turned white. Around him, his advisors exchanged horrified glances. The elven messenger, a tall elf named Sylvain, with eyes like chips of emerald ice, smiled as he delivered the ultimatum that would change everything. Humanity had 100 years to evacuate the borderlands, to retreat beyond the Iron Mountains, to surrender half their territory to elven expansion. The alternative was extinction. Not war, extinction. The elves would simply erase every human settlement with spells that could boil rivers and shatter mountains. Bastien Archambault stood in the shadows at the back of the hall, his engineer's apron still stained with forge soot. He was not nobility. He was not a general. He was a man who built bridges and calculated load-bearing weights, who understood physics and chemistry in ways that made the court wizards uncomfortable. As Sylvain's words echoed through the chamber, Bastien's mind was already working, already calculating, already seeing the problem as a series of solvable equations. The elves believed themselves untouchable because of their magic. But magic, Bastien knew, still obeyed the laws of energy and matter. And energy could be countered with sufficient force applied at the correct angle. "We accept your terms," King Etienne said finally. The elven messenger bowed mockingly and departed, leaving behind a hall full of broken men. But Bastien didn't feel broken. He felt something entirely different. A cold, focused rage that burned like a forge at maximum temperature. As the nobles filed out in defeat, Bastien approached the throne. The king looked at him with tired eyes, and Bastien spoke words that would echo through history. "Your Majesty, give me 3 years and access to the royal forges. I will give you a weapon that makes their magic irrelevant." The king studied this soot-stained commoner for a long moment. He saw something in Bastien's eyes, not hope exactly, but the dangerous certainty of a man who had solved an impossible problem. "You have 2 years," he said quietly, "and if you fail, we lose nothing we weren't already going to lose." Bastien bowed and left the hall immediately. He had no time to waste on courtly protocol. In his mind, he was already sketching designs for a weapon the world had never seen, a weapon that would make the elves' 10,000-year reign feel like a brief, arrogant mistake. That night, in his workshop on the edge of Montclair, Bastien lit every lantern and began to work. He pulled out texts on metallurgy, on explosive compounds used in mining, on the principles of pressure and expansion. The elves believed humanity was primitive because they lacked magic. But humanity had something the elves had never needed to develop: the desperate ingenuity of the powerless, the relentless innovation of those who couldn't afford to fail. By dawn, Bastien had filled 3 notebooks with calculations and sketches of what he would later call a cannon. It would throw a solid iron ball using controlled explosions. It would require no magic, no incantations, no centuries of study. Just iron, sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter. Just human brilliance, weaponized.
The Elven King laughed, unaware of the human secret. The royal forges of Montclair had never run this hot. Bastien worked 18-hour days, his face permanently smudged with soot, his hands calloused and burned from countless experiments. He recruited the kingdom's best blacksmiths, men like Aurélien Dufour, who could shape metal with impossible precision, and women like Marguerite Blanchard, who understood heat treatment better than any royal armorer. Together, they transformed the forge into something between a workshop and a laboratory. The nobility whispered that the king had gone mad, wasting resources on some peasant's fantasy. But Etienne visited the forge every week, watching Bastien's progress with the intensity of a drowning man watching a rope being lowered. The first challenge was the barrel. It needed to contain an explosion powerful enough to throw a 20-pound iron ball hundreds of yards, yet not shatter itself in the process. Bastien's early prototypes failed spectacularly, metal tubes splitting like overripe fruit, shrapnel embedding itself in workshop walls. After the 7th failure, Aurélien Dufour suggested a radical approach: wrap the barrel in layers, like a barrel for wine, each layer reinforcing the next. Bastien modified the design, adding iron bands heated and shrunk onto the barrel for additional strength. The 8th prototype held. When they test-fired it into the mountain behind the forge, the iron ball punched through 3 oak trees and buried itself in solid rock. The second challenge was the explosive mixture itself. The miner's black powder was too inconsistent, too unpredictable. Bastien needed something reliable, something that would burn at exactly the right speed to push the ball without destroying the barrel. He experimented with ratios. More sulfur made the mixture burn hotter but faster. More charcoal made it slower and weaker. He ground the components to different fineness levels. He tested granule sizes. Marguerite suggested adding small amounts of other compounds to stabilize the mixture. After hundreds of tests that left the forge reeking of sulfur and the workers' ears ringing, they found the formula. 15 parts saltpeter, 3 parts charcoal, 2 parts sulfur, ground fine and mixed dry. By the end of the first year, Bastien had a working cannon. It could fire reliably, accurately enough to hit a target the size of a wagon at 200 yards, and powerful enough to shatter stone walls. But one cannon wasn't enough. The elves would simply dodge it or counter it with protective spells. Bastien needed volume. He needed an artillery barrage that would overwhelm any magical defense through sheer, relentless force. He presented his plan to King Etienne. 100 cannons, operated by trained crews, all firing in coordinated volleys. The king blanched at the cost. The iron alone would bankrupt the treasury. But what choice did they have? Etienne gave the order. Every forge in the kingdom was converted to cannon production. Every blacksmith, every metalworker, every able-bodied person who could follow Bastien's precise specifications was recruited. The work became a national effort, a desperate race against the Elven Ultimatum. Bastien trained artillery crews in secret, teaching common soldiers the mathematics of trajectory and elevation, the careful measurement of powder charges, the timing of sequential fire. By the end of the second year, humanity had its answer to Elven magic: 120 cannons, each one a masterpiece of human engineering, each one proof that intelligence and determination could match power born from ancient spells.
The Elven king laughed, unaware of the human secret. The Elven scouts reported the human army's approach with amusement rather than alarm. They watched from the ancient forests as 2,000 human soldiers marched toward Lunathril, pulling strange wheeled contraptions behind their supply wagons. The scouts recognized General Genevieve Marchand at the head of the column, a competent military leader by human standards, but woefully outmatched against elven magic. What they didn't recognize were the iron tubes she was transporting, carefully wrapped in canvas and oilcloth to protect them from the rain. To elven eyes accustomed to magical staves and enchanted weapons, the cannons looked like peculiar construction equipment. Perhaps the humans planned to build siege towers. How primitive, how touchingly futile. Genevieve rode at the front of the column, her face set in grim determination. She had spent 6 months training with Bastion, learning the mathematics of artillery fire, the choreography of loading and firing, the critical importance of timing and coordination. She knew things the Elven scouts didn't, that each of those construction equipment tubes could throw a 20-pound iron ball through a castle wall, that her crews could fire 3 volleys in the time it took an Elven mage to complete a single spell, that human ingenuity had finally found a way to make magic irrelevant. But she kept her face neutral, her posture that of a general marching to an inevitable defeat. The journey took 12 days through increasingly hostile terrain. The elves controlled the forests, and their magic made the very trees hostile to human passage. Roots seemed to rise up to trip marching soldiers. Branches whipped faces without warning. At night, strange lights danced in the darkness, and soldiers swore they heard voices calling them into the woods. Genevieve lost 3 men to the forest's magic, good soldiers who wandered off despite orders and were found days later, aged 50 years in a single night. But she kept the column moving, kept morale steady by reminding them why they marched. They weren't marching to surrender. They were marching to end Elven supremacy forever. On the 13th day, they saw Lunathril for the first time. The eternal city rose from the valley like a dream made solid. Towers of crystal that caught sunlight and scattered it into rainbows. Walls that hummed with protective enchantments, visible even to human eyes as a faint shimmer of silver light. It was beautiful. It was ancient. It was, according to every military expert in human history, absolutely impregnable. The elves had designed Lunathril to be invincible, protected by spells that deflected arrows, absorbed fire, and turned siege engines into dust. No army had ever breached its walls. No conqueror had ever set foot inside its gates uninvited. The Elven king laughed, unaware of the human secret. Lord Caelethir stood on the celestial balcony, surrounded by the 9 members of the High Council, watching the humans work with detached amusement. Through his enchanted eyeglass, he could see every detail of their camp, the strange metal tubes being mounted on wooden frames, the soldiers moving bags of what looked like black powder, the intense focus on their faces. "They're building something," observed Lady Eliandra, her silver hair catching the afternoon light. "Perhaps some new type of catapult?" The council laughed. "Catapults against Lunethril's shields? They might as well throw pebbles at the moon." "Send an emissary," Caelethir decided. "Let's discover what new foolishness they've concocted." An hour later, 3 elven diplomats rode down to the human camp under a flag of truce. Genevieve received them with cold courtesy, offering wine they didn't drink and chairs they didn't sit in. The lead diplomat, a minor lord named Phaleon, looked around the camp with barely concealed contempt. "General Marchand," he said smoothly, "we appreciate your creative approach to the situation. However, the Council wishes to remind you that the ultimatum stands. You have 74 years remaining to evacuate the borderlands. There is no need for this theatrical display." Genevieve smiled, a sharp, predatory expression that made Felion momentarily uncomfortable. "We're not here to evacuate. We're here to renegotiate." Felion laughed, genuinely surprised. "Renegotiate? With what leverage, exactly? You stand before the Eternal City with 2,000 soldiers and some metal tubes. We stand behind walls that have never fallen, protected by magic you cannot comprehend." He gestured at the nearest cannon, its iron barrel gleaming dully in the sunlight. "What is this contraption supposed to be? Some new type of battering ram?" "Something like that," Genevieve replied, her smile never wavering. She walked over to the cannon and ran her hand along its barrel with the affection of someone touching a beloved weapon. "We call it a persuasion device. Would you like a demonstration?" Felion exchanged glances with his companions. "This should be entertaining." "By all means, General. Persuade us." Genevieve turned to her gunnery sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Alain Rousseau, who had trained on these weapons for 6 months straight. "Sergeant Rousseau, if you please. Target the dead oak on the northern ridge. Maximum charge." The Elven diplomats watched with polite curiosity as Rousseau's crew went through their choreography, swabbing the barrel, loading the powder charge, ramming home the iron ball, priming the touch hole. It looked absurdly complicated for whatever this device was supposed to do. Then Rousseau stepped back, applied the lit match to the touch hole, and the world exploded. The cannon's roar shattered the afternoon peace like a physical blow. Fire and smoke erupted from the barrel. The iron ball screamed through the air, a sound the elves had never heard, a sound like reality itself tearing. The dead oak on the northern ridge, 300 yards away, simply ceased to exist. The ball hit the trunk dead center and continued through, taking half the tree with it before burying itself in the hillside beyond. The silence that followed was deafening. Felion stood frozen, his perfect elven composure shattered. His companions had actually flinched at the sound, something no elf should ever do. Smoke drifted across the camp, carrying the acrid smell of burned powder. Genevieve walked back to the stunned diplomats, her smile now absolutely terrifying. "That's one cannon. I have 120. And in 3 days, every single one of them will be pointed at your Eternal City. Now, would you like to discuss renegotiation, or shall we proceed with the demonstration?"
The Elven King laughed, unaware of the human's secret. The Elven Council met in emergency session that evening. Felion's report had shaken even Calether's legendary composure. A weapon that threw solid metal without magic? That created explosions without incantations? It was unprecedented. It was disturbing. But surely, the council reasoned, it couldn't threaten Lunathrill's defenses. The city's shields had been woven by the greatest mages of the Third Age, reinforced over millennia, tested against dragonfire and demon siege. What could mere metal and explosions do against spells that had stood for 10,000 years? "We should test the shields," suggested Magister Thalion, the council's eldest member. "Let them fire their weapons at the outer wall. Let them waste their metal balls. Once they see their contraptions are useless against our magic, they'll lose heart and retreat." Calether considered this. Pride warred with caution in his ancient mind. On one hand, demonstrating the shield's invincibility would crush human morale and confirm elven supremacy. On the other hand, something about General Marchand's smile haunted him. She had looked too confident, too certain. But no, impossible. These were humans. Clever, perhaps, but ultimately limited by their mortality and their lack of connection to the deeper magics. "Very well," Calether decided. "At dawn, we'll lower the shields for exactly 1 minute. Let them fire their weapons. Let them see their efforts bounce harmlessly off our walls. Then we'll show them what real power looks like." The council agreed. orders were sent throughout the city. Citizens gathered on the walls and towers to watch the morning's entertainment, the moment when human pretension would shatter against elven reality. As night fell, Lunathril glittered with magical light, its defenders absolutely certain that tomorrow would reinforce the natural order. Elves above, humans below, and the eternal city standing unbreached for another 10,000 years. In the human camp, Genevieve gathered her officers for final preparations. She had anticipated this. The elven's arrogance was as predictable as sunrise. They would give her a test shot, expecting failure, giving her the perfect opportunity to calibrate her weapons against real targets. When they lower the shields, we fire the ranging battery, she instructed. 6 cannons spread across the wall's length. I want precise impact points. I want to know exactly how those crystal walls respond to solid shot. Trajectories, penetration depth, structural weak points. This isn't about destroying anything yet. This is about gathering data. Her gunnery officers nodded. They had drilled this scenario repeatedly. Bastien Archambault himself had traveled with the army, and he sat in Genevieve's tent now, making final calculations by lantern light. The crystal structure is harder than granite, but more brittle, he explained, sketching diagrams. High-velocity impact should create fracture lines that propagate through the matrix. If we can identify the stress points in their wall's architecture, we can target the joints where different crystal sections meet. That's where they'll be weakest. He looked up at Genevieve with eyes that hadn't slept properly in 2 years. One shot won't do it, but one shot will tell us exactly how to break them.
The Elven King laughed, unaware of the human secret. The sun rose over Lunathril, painting the crystal walls gold and rose. Lord Caelethir stood on the celestial balcony, surrounded by the full council and half the city's population, all eager to witness humanity's humiliation. At precisely dawn, he nodded to the Shieldmaster, and the protective enchantments faded, not completely, but enough to let physical objects through. The walls themselves remained, ancient and beautiful, each crystal block perfectly fitted to its neighbor, the whole structure resonating with defensive spells woven into its very substance. 1 minute, Caelethir announced. Let the humans have their moment. In the camp below, Genevieve watched the shimmer around the city's walls fade. Battery 1, she said calmly. Fire. 6 cannons roared in sequence, each one aimed at a different section of wall. The sound was apocalyptic, a rolling thunder that echoed off the mountains and sent flocks of birds screaming into the sky. The elven crowd on the walls gasped, flinched, grabbed each other in shock. But their shock turned to relieved laughter as they watched the iron balls strike. 5 of them hit the crystal and cracked it, spiderweb fractures spreading from each impact point but not breaking through. The 6th ball, aimed slightly lower, actually bounced off and tumbled into the valley. You see, Caelethir announced triumphantly to his people, their weapons scratch our walls like raindrops scratch diamond. The eternal city stands as it always has. The crowd cheered. The council smiled. The Shieldmaster raised the protective enchantments back to full strength, and the walls shimmered silver once more. Down in the human camp, surely General Marchand was realizing the futility of her position. Surely her soldiers were losing heart seeing their miracle weapons reduced to noisy annoyances. Surely this would be the end of human resistance. But Genevieve wasn't despairing. She was smiling. Around her, Bastien and the gunnery officers were frantically sketching the impact points, comparing notes, arguing about stress propagation and crystal matrix failure. Did you see the 4th impact? Bastien asked excitedly. The crack spread 15 feet in both directions. That's the load-bearing section. It's under the most structural stress. He turned to Genevieve, his soot-stained face lit with fierce joy. General, I know where to hit them. The wall's architecture has 3 critical stress points where different crystal sections meet. If we concentrate fire there, sustained, heavy fire, the fractures will propagate until the entire section fails. Genevieve studied his diagrams, then looked up at Lunethril's walls. The elves thought they'd just proven their invincibility. They'd actually just given her a complete map of their weaknesses. How many shots? She asked quietly.
Bastien calculated quickly. On the southern stress point, 20 direct hits should create enough fractured propagation to cause catastrophic structural failure, 40 shots to be absolutely certain. Genevieve nodded slowly. She had 120 cannons. She could deliver 40 shots in less than 10 minutes if her crews maintained peak efficiency. "Begin preparations," she ordered. "Tomorrow at dawn, we breach the Eternal City." That night, while Lunethril celebrated what they believed was humanity's defeat, Genevieve's artillery crews worked in disciplined silence. They positioned 60 cannons to target the southern stress point Bastien had identified, the section where the main gate's crystal arch met the wall's foundation. They pre-measured powder charges for maximum velocity. They stacked iron balls within arm's reach of every cannon. They practiced the choreography of loading and firing until every movement was muscle memory. By midnight, they were ready. By dawn, they would make history.
The Elven King laughed, unaware of the human secret. Dawn broke cold and clear. The Elven guards on Lunethril's walls paid little attention to the human cap below. Yesterday's demonstration had proven the Eternal City's invincibility, and today would surely see the start of humanity's retreat. But then, they noticed something odd. The humans weren't packing up. They were gathering around their metal tubes in unusually large numbers, all of them focused on the southern section of wall. Lord Calathair was summoned from his morning meditation. He arrived on the celestial balcony just as Genevieve gave the order that would echo through history. "Battery 1 through 12, she said calmly. "Southern stress point. Fire for effect." 60 cannons roared simultaneously. The sound was beyond thunder. It was the voice of human ingenuity screaming defiance at 10,000 years of elven supremacy. The iron balls struck the southern wall section in a devastating cluster, each impact building on the last. Crystal fractured, stress lines propagated, the defensive spells woven into the wall's matrix flared desperately, trying to absorb and redistribute the kinetic energy, but magic had never been designed to counter this relentless, mathematical application of force. "Again!" Genevieve shouted. The crews went exact same section of wall. The fractures deepened. The stress point groaned. Elven mages on the walls desperately tried to reinforce the crystal with healing spells, but you couldn't heal physics. You couldn't magically undo the laws of energy transfer and structural failure. The third volley hit, and entire crystal blocks began to shift. The fourth volley and the defensive enchantments started to flicker and fail. On the celestial balcony, Calathair stood frozen in dawning horror. This wasn't possible. This wasn't how war worked. You didn't just throw metal at walls until they broke. Walls were supposed to be protected by magic, and magic was supposed to be absolute. But as the fifth volley struck and a 20-foot section of the southern wall began to visibly sag, he understood something that would haunt him forever. Humanity had found a way to make magic irrelevant. They had weaponized mathematics itself. The sixth volley was the breaking point. The southern stress point catastrophically failed. Crystal blocks weighing tons simply sheared away from their neighbors as the fracture lines reached critical propagation. The wall section collapsed inward with the sound like a mountain breaking, taking a 50-yard stretch of Lunethril's supposedly eternal defenses with it. Dust and crystal shards filled the air. The defensive enchantments, suddenly lacking physical structure to anchor to, dissipated like morning fog, and through the settling dust, Genevieve could see straight into the Eternal City, see the shocked faces of elven citizens who had never imagined their walls could fall, see the panicked guards scrambling for weapons, see the impossible made manifest.
The Elven King laughed, unaware of the human secret. Genevieve didn't hesitate. "Infantry forward! Artillery, suppress the walls!" Her assault troops, 500 soldiers trained specifically for urban combat, charged toward the breach, while the remaining cannon shifted their aim to the towers flanking the collapsed section. More iron balls screamed through the air, forcing elven defenders to take cover instead of raining spells on the advancing humans. The plan was working exactly as Bastien had calculated. Create the breach, suppress defensive fire, exploit the gap before the elves could organize a response. Speed was everything. The first human soldiers through the breach were led by Captain Elaine Devereaux, a woman who had spent 6 months studying Bastien's architectural diagrams of Lunathril. She knew where the major thoroughfares led, where the defensive choke points would be, where the Elven Guard barracks were located. As her troops poured into the city, she split them into 3 groups, one to secure the breach itself, one to push toward the gate mechanisms to open Lunathrill's main gates from inside, one to create chaos and confusion in the eastern districts. The elves expected orderly warfare, magical duels between opposing mages. They got street fighting, ambush tactics, and brutal efficiency. The elven response was hampered by sheer disbelief. For the first hour after the breach, elven commanders couldn't accept what was happening. Reports flooded in. Humans were inside the city. Humans were fighting in the Crystal Plaza. Humans were setting fires in the eastern quarter. But it made no sense. Lunathril didn't fall. Lunathril was eternal. By the time Lord Calathyr accepted reality and ordered an organized counterattack, Elaine's troops had already secured 3 major intersections and were advancing on the gate mechanism building. The fighting in Lunathrill's streets was brutal and close. Elven magic was devastating in open warfare, but in narrow crystal corridors with smoke and dust obscuring vision, it lost much of its advantage. Human crossbows and short swords were perfectly suited for this environment. Elaine's troops used tactics the elves found disgraceful, hiding behind corners, throwing improvised explosives into buildings, targeting elven officers first to disrupt command structures. But disgraceful or not, it was effective. By noon, the main gates groaned open from the inside, and the rest of Genevieve's army poured into the Eternal City. Bastien entered with the second wave, not as a soldier, but as an engineer. His target was the central spire, the massive crystal tower at Lunathrill's heart, where the city's most powerful enchantments were anchored and maintained. If he could reach the spire's foundation and collapse it, the entire city's defensive magic network would fail catastrophically. He moved through the captured districts with a small escort, carrying not weapons, but carefully wrapped packages of black powder and detailed architectural diagrams. The Eternal City's days of standing were numbered in hours now. The central spire rose 300 feet above Lunathrill's heart, a masterwork of crystal architecture and magical engineering that had taken elvish masters 5 centuries to complete. Its foundation extended deep underground, anchored in bedrock and threaded with enchantment channels that powered the city's shields, wards, and defensive systems. It was beautiful, it was ancient, and according to Bastien's calculations, it had a critical structural weakness that no elf had ever considered because they designed for magical threats, not physical ones. Bastien's escort fought their way through the crystal gardens toward the spire's base, meeting increasingly desperate elven resistance. Mages who had spent centuries perfecting light-weaving and illusion spells found themselves facing soldiers with crossbows who didn't care how beautiful or intricate their magic was. The escort's captain, a scarred veteran named Etienne Moreau, took an elven lightning bolt to his shoulder and kept fighting, driven by the same desperate determination that powered the entire human assault. They had one chance to end elven supremacy forever. Pain was irrelevant. They reached the spire's foundation entrance just before sunset. Bastien immediately went to work, while his escort barricaded the doors against pursuing elven guards. The foundation chamber was a marvel, crystal pillars supporting impossible weight, enchantment lines glowing with soft blue light. The hum of magical energy so intense it made Bastien's teeth ache. But he ignored the beauty and the magic, focusing on the physics, the load-bearing structures, the points where force applied correctly would cause cascading failure. He placed his black powder charges with surgical precision, not randomly,
but at the exact points where the crystal pillars transferred the spire's weight to the foundation. Small charges, carefully calculated to crack but not explode, to create fracture propagation that would spread slowly at first and then accelerate geometrically. This wasn't destruction for destruction's sake. This was architectural assassination. "How long?" Etienne asked, reloading his crossbow as elven magic hammered at the barricaded doors. 20 minutes to place the charges," Bastien replied, his hand steady despite the chaos. Then, 10 seconds after ignition, the spire begins to fall. 5 minutes until complete structural collapse. The doors shattered inward in a blast of elven fire. Etienne and his soldiers met the charging elven guards with desperate ferocity, fighting to buy Bastien those precious 20 minutes. Crossbow bolts and sword steel against magical shields and elven blades. Blood, red human blood and silver elven ichor splattered across ancient crystal floors. Men died screaming. Elves fell with looks of disbelief. But the line held, the escort held, and Bastien worked with the calm focus of a master craftsman, placing each charge, running each fuse line, double-checking every calculation, because there would be no second chance.
"Done," Bastien shouted. "Fall back." The surviving escort members, Etienne and 3 others, all wounded, retreated from the foundation chamber while Bastien lit the master fuse. They ran through Lunatril's crystal corridors as behind them the charges began to detonate in precise sequence. Not loud explosions, quiet cracks, barely audible above the sounds of battle raging throughout the city. But each crack created fractures, and fractures propagated. And the central spire, which had stood for 5,000 years, began to die. The first visible sign was a groan, a deep, impossible sound as crystal under tremendous stress began to fail. Elven citizens and human soldiers alike stopped fighting and looked up at the spire. Cracks were appearing in its surface, thin lines of darkness spreading through the translucent crystal like veins of shadow. The enchantment lines flickered. The magical hum that had pervaded Lunatril for millennia began to falter. Lord Calither, fighting desperately in the Crystal Plaza, felt the city's defensive magic start to collapse and understood with perfect, terrible clarity what was about to happen. The central spire fell with the inevitability of mathematics. The foundation pillars failed in sequence, exactly as Bastien had calculated. The spire tilted, slowly at first, and then with accelerating momentum. 300 feet of ancient crystal, countless tons of architectural masterwork and magical infrastructure came down on Lunatril's central districts. The impact was apocalyptic. Buildings shattered, streets buckled. The shockwave knocked fighters, human and elven alike, off their feet. And as the spire shattered across half the city, the enchantment network it had anchored simply ceased to exist. Lunatril's defensive magic died with the spire. Shields that had turned aside dragonfire flickered and vanished. Wards that had stood for 10,000 years unraveled. Protective enchantments woven into the city's very structure faded like morning mist. The eternal city was suddenly horribly modal. Just crystal and stone, no longer protected by ancient spells, no longer impregnable. The elven defenders felt it like a physical wound, that sudden absence of the magical strength they had always taken for granted. And in that moment of shock and grief, Genevieve's army surged forward. By nightfall, the fighting was effectively over. Pockets of elven resistance still held out in the northern districts, but the city's heart was broken. Its walls were breached, its spire was rubble, its magic was gone. Lord Calither stood in the ruins of the Crystal Plaza, surrounded by the bodies of his guards, and watched General Marchand approach with her troops. He was ancient and powerful and had never known defeat. Until now. Until these impossible, relentless humans had brought war itself to a place that had forgotten war could touch it.
The remaining members of the High Council gathered in what was left of the council chamber, half of it buried under spire rubble, open to the night sky where crystal ceiling had been. They were 7 now, not 9. Lady Eleandra had died when the spire fell, crushed under the very architecture she had helped maintain for 3 centuries. Magister Thalion had been killed in the street fighting, cut down by a human soldier who didn't know or care that he was murdering an elf who had lived since the First Age. The survivors looked diminished somehow, their perfect elven bearing broken by shock and grief. Genevieve entered with Bastien, Elaine, and a guard of honor. Her uniform was torn and blood-stained, not all of it her own. She had been fighting in the streets alongside her soldiers, leading from the front like the humans always did because they couldn't afford to waste lives carelessly. She looked at the 7 elven lords with eyes that held no triumph, only exhausted determination. "Lord Calethia," she said formally, "I believe we have something to renegotiate." Calethir stood among the ruins of his certainty and felt the weight of 10,000 years of supremacy collapsing. "How?" he asked, his voice hollow. "How did you do this? We are magic made flesh! We are eternal! We are—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Bastien stepped forward, his engineer's apron still covered in powder burns. "You are ancient," he said quietly. "And you forgot that the universe doesn't care about your age or your magic. Physics is physics. Energy is energy. You built everything on the assumption that magic made you invincible. We built weapons that made magic irrelevant." "The ultimatum is void," Genevieve continued. "Humanity will not evacuate the borderlands. We will not retreat beyond the Iron Mountains. We will not surrender our territory." She paused, letting that sink in. "But we're not here to exterminate you either. We're here to establish a new reality. Elves and humans as equals, not rulers and subjects. Equals." Calethia wanted to rage, to reject this humiliation, to call up the ancient magics and smite these upstart mortals. But his city was broken, his people were defeated, and, somewhere in his ancient mind, a thought crystallized that he had never expected to have. Perhaps the elves had been wrong. "What are your terms?" he asked finally, each word like ash in his mouth. Genevieve produced a document, terms that Bastien and King Etienne had drafted months ago, never truly believing they'd have a chance to present them. A treaty of mutual sovereignty, recognition of human territorial rights, open trade between our peoples, a joint council to mediate disputes, and, she emphasized this carefully, an end to elven expansion at humanity's expense. You keep what you have, we keep what we have, and we find a way forward that doesn't require one race subjugating the other. The Elven Council looked at each other. They had lived for centuries, some for millennia. They remembered ages when humans had been primitive, barely capable of language. The idea of treating them as equals was almost incomprehensible. But Lunethral's broken walls and shattered spire were very comprehensible arguments. Lady Sylvain, the council's youngest member at merely 500 years old, spoke the thought they were all thinking. "We accept." Calethir closed his eyes briefly, then opened them and nodded. "We accept."
The treaty was signed 3 days later in the ruins of the Crystal Plaza, witnessed by human soldiers and elven citizens alike. King Etienne himself traveled to Lunethril to put his seal on the document, and when he saw what his engineer and his general had accomplished, he wept openly. The Eternal City had fallen. The ultimatum was void. Humanity had proven that magic and ancient power could be defeated by ingenuity and determination. It was the most important moment in human history, and it happened not with celebration, but with exhaustion and grief. Bastien walked through the ruined city, making notes on structural damage, already calculating what could be salvaged and what would need to be completely rebuilt. Elven engineers approached him hesitantly, asking questions about his cannons, his explosives, his understanding of stress propagation through crystal matrices.
He answered them honestly, and something remarkable happened. Knowledge began to flow both ways. The elves knew things about material properties and magical reinforcement that could make Bastien's designs even better. Bastien knew things about physics and chemistry that could enhance elven construction. The exchange was tentative, wary, but genuine. Genevieve met with the elven military commanders to discuss the withdrawal of human forces. It was delicate work. Her army occupied Lunethril, and the elves were technically defeated, but sustainable peace required more than just military victory. It required the defeated to feel that surrender had been honorable, that the terms were fair, that their conquerors weren't monsters. She established strict rules for her troops. No looting, no desecration of elven sacred sites, no brutality towards civilians. Soldiers who violated these rules faced immediate execution. The message was clear. Humanity had won, but they would win with honor. The elven civilians struggled to process what had happened. For 10,000 years, they had been the superior race, the magical masters of the world. Now that certainty was shattered. Some elves retreated into denial, insisting this was temporary, that elven magic would reassert dominance. Others, particularly the younger generations, looked at the humans with new eyes, seeing not primitive inferiors, but dangerous equals, who had just demonstrated terrifying capability. A third group, smaller but growing, began to wonder if perhaps the age of elven supremacy had been built on comfortable lies that deserved to be shattered. On the fourth day, Genevieve's army began its withdrawal from Lunethril. They left behind a city forever changed, walls breached, spire fallen, defensive magic broken, but they also left behind something unexpected: hope. Not the false hope of supremacy, but the real hope that comes from recognizing equals, from understanding that the universe is big enough for multiple peoples to thrive without one needing to dominate the others. As the last human soldiers marched through the broken gates, Lord Calathir stood on what remained of the celestial balcony and watched them go, feeling something he hadn't in millennia: uncertainty about the future and strange curiosity about what that uncertain future might bring.
The journey back to Montclair took 2 weeks. Genevieve's army marched slowly, carrying their wounded and their dead, dragging the cannons that had changed the world. They were welcomed as heroes in every human settlement they passed. Word of Lunethril's fall had spread like wildfire, and people who had lived their entire lives under the shadow of elven ultimatums now saw a future where humanity controlled its own destiny. But the soldiers themselves were quieter than heroes should be. They had seen what war cost, had buried friends, had learned that victory and glory rarely existed in the same place. Bastien rode near the front of the column, his mind already moving to the next problem. The cannons had worked, the elves had fallen, but now humanity had unleashed something that couldn't be put back in the bottle, weapons that made traditional defenses obsolete, that changed the fundamental mathematics of warfare. Other human kingdoms would want cannons. The elves, despite the treaty, would eventually develop countermeasures. An arms race was beginning, and Bastien felt the weight of that responsibility. He had given humanity a weapon. Now he needed to give them wisdom to use it correctly. King Etienne met them at Montclair's gates, and the celebration that followed was genuine but subdued. There was feasting and songs and honors distributed to the soldiers who had fought in the Eternal City. Genevieve was made High Marshal of the realm. Bastien received a noble title he had no idea what to do with. The common soldiers got land grants and pensions. But beneath the celebration was a sobriety. Everyone understood that the world had fundamentally changed, that the comfortable certainties of the past were gone, that humanity now lived in an age where they were no longer the underdog, but a major power with all the responsibilities that entailed. In the weeks following the victory, delegations arrived from across the human kingdoms. They wanted cannons. They wanted Bastien's knowledge. They wanted to know how Montclair had defeated the elves when every military expert in history had said it was impossible. King Etienne established strict controls on cannon production. The weapons would be shared, but carefully, with trusted allies, and with clear agreements on how they could be used. The last thing humanity needed was to turn their new weapons on each other. But the most significant delegation was Elven. 3 months after the fall of Lunathril, Lady Sylvain arrived in Montclair with a small group of Elven scholars, engineers, and diplomats. They came not to demand, but to request. Could Bastien and his team share their knowledge? Could humanity and Elvenkind establish joint research into ways to make both peoples more secure without threatening each other? It was unprecedented. It was awkward. It was absolutely necessary. And when Bastien agreed, when Elven and human engineers began working together in Montclair's forges, something new was born. Not supremacy of one race over another, but collaboration between equals.
The change in geopolitical reality became apparent 6 months later, when the demon armies of the Northern Wastes, sensing weakness in the traditional power structure, launched an invasion across the frozen march. It was the kind of threat that would have required elven intervention in the past. Demons were immune to most human magic, and their corrupted flesh could shrug off conventional weapons. The human kingdoms would have had to beg elven protection, accepting whatever humiliating terms came with it. But this was not the past. Genevieve marched north with an army of humans, and remarkably, elven volunteers. The demons besieged Frostholm, a critical human fortress, expecting to simply overwhelm it with their usual tactics: corrupted magic, fear aura, physical might that made them nearly invincible in close combat. What they got instead was concentrated artillery fire that didn't care about magical immunity or supernatural resilience. Bastien's cannons tore through demon ranks with the same mathematical precision they had used on Lunathrill's walls. Iron balls shattered demonic armor. Explosive shells, a new innovation from the human-elven research collaboration, detonated among demon formations. The elven volunteers fought alongside human soldiers, combining magical long-range attacks with artillery support in ways that neither race could have achieved alone. Elven mages would mark targets with light spells, making them visible to human artillery crews at night. Human cannons would breach demon fortifications, allowing elven strike teams to exploit the gaps. It was warfare reimagined, not as a contest of individual magical might, but as coordinated application of diverse capabilities. The demons, who had terrified both races separately for millennia, found themselves utterly outmatched by this combined force. The siege of Frostholm lasted 3 days, exactly as long as the siege of Lunathril had lasted, a fact that did not escape anyone's notice. On the 3rd day, the demon warlord himself emerged from the northern wastes, a creature of pure corruption 15 feet tall and supposedly unkillable by mortal means. Bastien and the elven mage engineer Eotheron had been waiting for this moment. They had developed a special weapon specifically for this moment, a cannon loaded not with iron ball, but with a shell filled with alchemical silver and blessed salt, compounds that elven magic amplified to lethal potency against corrupted beings. The shot that killed the demon warlord was fired by a human crew and blessed by an elven priest. It traveled 800 yards, farther than any previous shot, and struck the warlord's center mass. The creature exploded in a flash of purifying light, its corrupted essence unable to withstand the combination of human engineering and elven sanctification. The surviving demons fled. The siege was broken, and both races learned a critical lesson. Together, they could face threats that would have defeated either one alone.
5 years after the fall of Lunathril, Bastien stood on a rebuilt section of the city's walls, still crystal, still beautiful, but now reinforced with human engineering principles and elven magical enhancement. The spire had been rebuilt too, shorter than before, but structurally sounder, incorporating everything both races had learned about combining magic and physics. The city was a symbol now, not of elven supremacy, but of collaborative rebuilding. It was imperfect, It was awkward, but it was possible. Lord Caelither joined him on the wall, the ancient elf moving more slowly than before, but with something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Humility, perhaps, or maybe just the wisdom that comes from having your certainty shattered and discovering you can survive it. "I hated you," Caelither said conversationally. "For years, I hated what you did to this city, to my people, to our place in the world." Bastian nodded, not offended. "And now?" Caelither smiled slightly. "Now I think perhaps we needed our certainty shattered. We had become stagnant in our supremacy. You forced us to grow again." The joint Human-Elven Council met monthly now in Montclair and Lunathril alternately. They argued constantly about territorial disputes, resource allocation, magical ethics, weapons development limits, but they argued as equals, and the arguments rarely escalated to violence anymore. The treaty held because both sides understood what the alternative looked like. Lunathrill's broken walls served as a permanent reminder that supremacy was expensive and equality was the only sustainable path forward. Genevieve had retired from active military service, but she trained the next generation of human commanders in a new philosophy of warfare, one that emphasized overwhelming force applied with precision, but also the critical importance of knowing when not to use that force. Her academy in Montclair attracted students from across the human kingdoms and, surprisingly, elven military observers who came to learn the tactics that had defeated their supposedly invincible city. The knowledge exchange went both ways. Elven combat magic, combined with human artillery doctrine, created military capabilities that neither race had imagined possible alone. The most significant change happened in the younger generations. Elven children who had grown up in the aftermath of Lunathrill's fall didn't carry their parents' assumption of natural superiority. Human children who grew up seeing elven scholars working alongside human engineers didn't carry their parents' resentment and fear. They met in joint schools established along the border regions, learning each other's languages and histories, discovering that the supposedly fundamental differences between the races were far less important than the similarities. They were the future, messy, uncertain, but genuinely hopeful. Bastian's final project was a joint marvel, a bridge across the Silverpine Gorge that connected human and elven territories, built using combined engineering and magical principles that neither race could have achieved alone. The bridge's foundations were human-designed steel and stone, earthquake-resistant and precisely calculated. Its upper structure was elven crystal, lighter than any human material, but reinforced with enchantments that drew on the bridge's own physical structure for power. It was beautiful and functional, a physical manifestation of what cooperation could create. On the day of the bridge's dedication, representatives from both races gathered at its midpoint, the exact border between human and elven territory. King Etienne, now elderly but still sharp, spoke of the journey from ultimatum to equality. Lord Caelither, looking frailer than ever but more at peace, spoke of the lessons learned through humiliation and the strange grace of defeat. But the most important moment came when a human child and an elven child, born in the years after the treaty, walked across the bridge together without fear, without hesitation, simply as friends exploring a new path their parents had built. Bastian watched them and felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel during the desperate years of weapon development and the brutal days of siege: satisfaction. Not triumph, exactly. The cost had been too high for triumph. Too many dead on both sides. Too much destroyed that could never be fully restored. But satisfaction that humanity had proven what needed proving, that intelligence and determination could overcome any obstacle, that ingenuity was as powerful as magic, that the supposedly weak could become strong when they refused to accept their assigned place in the world. As the sun set over the Silverpine Bridge, painting the crystal sections gold and rose while the steel foundations gleamed like silver, Bastian turned to Genevieve, who had traveled from Montclair for the dedication. Was it worth it, she asked quietly, knowing he would understand what she meant, all the death, all the destruction, all the breaking of ancient certainties. Bastian looked at the two children laughing as they raced across the bridge, at the mixed crowds of humans and elves celebrating together, at old soldiers from both sides sharing drinks and war stories, finding unexpected common ground in shared trauma and survival. It was imperfect. It was awkward. Some old grudges still simmered. Some wounds would never fully heal. But it was real. It was possible. And as Bastian looked out over the bridge he had designed, that impossible structure connecting two people who had been enemies, he understood that this was the true fuck yeah moment. Not the cannons firing, not the walls falling, not the ancient city conquered, but this, the bridge built afterward, the children who crossed it without fear, the future where humanity didn't win by destroying their enemies, but by proving that enemies could become partners. That was the victory worth celebrating. That was the triumph that would echo through the ages. Humanity had been given an ultimatum, and they answered not just with weapons, but with a vision of what the world could become when intelligence, determination, and refusal to accept injustice combined to reshape reality itself. The age of elven supremacy was over. The age of human subjugation was over. The age of equals, messy, contentious, but genuinely collaborative, had begun. And it all started with an engineer who refused to accept that magic made might, a general who understood that the best victories are the ones that lead to lasting peace, and a people who proved that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage of all.